Step inside timeless witnesses, where the past never stays quiet. It's Manchester, 1847 AD, and the hour is deep into the night. You wake, not to silence, but to the trembling sound of someone crying beyond the fragile wall at your side. The barrier between your bed and the master suite is so thin, it seems to breathe with each shudder of your sister's sobs. Outside, November frost clings to the townhouse like a second skin, seeping its cold fingers through every crack. In this hour, when even the streets seem frozen in place, you realize something has shifted in the dark. You pull the rough wool blanket closer, but the chill isn't just from the air. It's from knowing exactly what happened in that room tonight, and knowing there's nothing you can do about it. Your sister Margaret married well, everyone said. Charles Whitmore owns 3 textile mills and a grand house on the respectable side of town. The wedding was the social event of the season, with imported French lace and enough flowers to stock a conservatory. Margaret looked radiant in her white silk gown, though you noticed how her hands trembled when she signed the marriage certificate. Now, 6 months later, those same hands bear the faint yellow remnants of bruises that never quite seem to heal. The sobbing stops. You hear Charles's heavy footsteps across the floorboards, the creak of the door, then silence. In the morning, Margaret will come down to breakfast with a high-neck dress and powder carefully applied to her throat. She'll pour tea with steady hands and ask about the weather. Charles will read his newspaper and complain about the servants. No one will mention the sounds from the night before, because in Victorian England, what happens between a husband and wife is sacred, private, and entirely beyond the reach of law or intervention. This is marriage in the Victorian era, not the romantic ideal of literature and period dramas, but the brutal reality that existed behind lace curtains and polite society. Tonight, we're pulling back those curtains to reveal what marriage truly meant for women. In an age when love was luxury and survival was the only certainty. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Margaret's story isn't unusual. In 1847 AD, when she married Charles Whitmore, the legal doctrine of coverture meant that she ceased to exist as a person in the eyes of the law. The moment she said, "I do," her identity, her property, her very body became the legal possession of her husband. Sir William Blackstone, the great legal scholar, explained it plainly in his commentaries on the laws of England. The husband and wife are one person in law, that is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, suspended, as if she were a clock that had stopped ticking, a book closed mid-sentence, a song cut short. Margaret owned nothing now. Not the inheritance from her father, not the jewelry she'd worn since childhood, not even the clothes on her back. Charles could sell her possessions, spend her money, and make every decision about her life without consulting her. If she earned money through work, it belonged to him. If she wrote a novel and it became successful, the profits were his. She couldn't sign a contract, couldn't sue or be sued, couldn't even write a will without his permission. The transformation was immediate and total. on her wedding day. Margaret Hartwell disappeared and became Mrs. Charles Whitmore, a legal non-entity whose existence was defined entirely by her relationship to a man. She was no longer a person. She was a possession, valuable but ultimately disposable. But the legal obliteration was only the beginning. Victorian marriage was built on a foundation of deliberate ignorance and calculated shame. Young women entered marriage knowing virtually nothing about what would be expected of them. Sex education was not just absent, it was actively forbidden. Mothers whispered vague warnings about wifely duties and submitting to your husband's needs, but specifics were considered too vulgar for decent conversation. Eleanor Glynn, writing in her memoir decades later, described her wedding night in 1892 AD. I was as ignorant as a child of 5. My mother had told me nothing whatsoever about what marriage meant. I went to my wedding in a state of complete innocence, expecting perhaps to hold hands and receive gentle kisses. When my husband approached me that night, I was so terrified I thought I was dying. This ignorance wasn't accidental. It was carefully cultivated. Victorian society believed that knowledge about sex would corrupt women's natural purity and make them morally suspect. Good women weren't supposed to enjoy physical intimacy. They endured it as a duty. Dr. William Acton, a respected physician, wrote in 1862 AD that the majority of women are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. Any woman who showed signs of sexual desire was considered abnormal, possibly even nymphomaniacal. The wedding night became a traumatic initiation for countless women. Mary Kingsley, the famous explorer, wrote privately to a friend, "Marriage is legalized rape. There is no other word for what happens to women who enter it unprepared." The phrase, "Close your eyes and think of England," became a common refrain. Women were expected to endure sex for the good of the empire, producing the next generation of citizens while finding no pleasure in the process. But even more devastating than the physical trauma was the psychological isolation. Women couldn't discuss their experiences, couldn't seek help, couldn't even admit that they were suffering. To complain about marital relations was to admit moral failure. A good wife submitted cheerfully to her husband's desires, no matter how painful or degrading. She smiled in public and suffered in private, trapped by shame and silence. The bedroom became a site of regular assault, but calling it assault was unthinkable. Marital rape wasn't legally recognized as a crime. It was considered a contradiction in terms. A husband owned his wife's body and could use it as he pleased. The marriage vows included honor and obey for the woman, and love and cherish for the man. But these were aspirational rather than binding. The law provided no recourse for a woman whose husband was brutal, violent, or sexually abusive. Court records from the Old Bailey reveal the extent of this legal helplessness. In 1854 AD, a woman named Sarah Henderson brought a case against her husband for cruel and unusual treatment. The evidence showed that he had beaten her regularly, forced himself on her nightly despite her obvious distress, and threatened to kill her if she left. The judge dismissed the case, ruling that a husband cannot be guilty of rape upon his wife, for by their mutual matrimonial consent and contract. The wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband. The economic trap was equally devastating. Women couldn't work most jobs, couldn't own property, couldn't control their own money. Even wealthy women lived at the mercy of their husband's generosity. Margaret Whitmore discovered this reality when she asked Charles for money to visit her sick mother. He refused, not because they couldn't afford it, but because he didn't want her to go. She had no money of her own, no way to pay for transportation, no legal right to house against his wishes. For middle-class women, the situation was even more precarious. They couldn't work without losing their social status, but they had no inherited wealth to fall back on. Marriage became an economic necessity, a transaction where a woman traded her freedom for financial security. The pressure to marry was enormous. Unmarried women were pitied, mocked, and gradually excluded from society. They became spinsters, social failures, who had somehow failed to secure a man. The marriage market was brutal and calculating. Parents evaluated potential suitors based on their financial prospects, not their character. A man's ability to provide was more important than his kindness, his intelligence, or his compatibility with his future wife. Women were assessed like livestock, their beauty, their dowry, their breeding potential, their ability to manage a household and enhance their husband's social standing. Courtship was a carefully choreographed performance with rigid rules about proper behavior. Young women couldn't be alone with men, couldn't speak freely about their thoughts and feelings, couldn't show any sign of physical attraction. They were supposed to be charming, but not too clever, beautiful, but not too sensual, accomplished, but not too ambitious. The goal was to attract a husband while maintaining perfect virtue, a nearly impossible balance that left many women feeling like performers in their own lives. The engagement period was often the happiest time in a woman's life because it represented hope and possibility. Once married, those possibilities evaporated. Take the case of Emma Darwin, wife of Charles Darwin. Before marriage, she was an accomplished pianist and thoughtful correspondent who engaged in deep theological discussions. After marriage, she became a devoted wife and mother whose intellectual pursuits were subordinated to her husband's work. Her letters show a gradual shrinking of her world as domestic duties consumed her time and energy. The pressure to produce children was immediate and relentless. A woman's primary value was her fertility, and failure to conceive was seen as a personal failing. The average Victorian woman was pregnant or nursing for most of her adult life. Queen Victoria herself, despite her access to the best medical care, had 9 children and famously despised pregnancy and childbirth. She wrote to her daughter, "What you say of the pride of giving life to an immortal soul is very fine, dear, but I own I cannot enter into that. I think much more of our being like a cow or a dog at such moments." If even the Queen found pregnancy burdensome, imagine the experience of ordinary women. They had no reliable contraception, no safe abortion options, no choice about when or how often to bear children. Each pregnancy was a gamble with death. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. 1 in every 200 births resulted in the mother's death. Childbirth was agonizing, dangerous, and often fatal. The medical establishment made the situation worse with their ignorance and arrogance. Doctors believed that women's bodies were fundamentally flawed, that their reproductive organs made them inherently unstable and prone to hysteria. Any physical or emotional complaint was attributed to the uterus, the wandering womb that supposedly caused all female ailments. Treatment often involved rest cures that were actually psychological torture, keeping women isolated and inactive until they became genuinely ill. Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell popularized the rest cure in the 1870s AD, prescribing complete bed rest, isolation from family and friends, and prohibition of all intellectual activity. Charlotte Perkins Gilman underwent this treatment and later wrote The Yellow Wallpaper, a haunting story about a woman driven to madness by enforced inactivity. The rest cure was torture disguised as medicine, a way to break women's spirits and force them into submission. The cult of domesticity trapped women in their homes, making them prisoners of their own supposed nature. True women were supposed to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. They were the angel in the house, creatures too delicate and spiritual for the harsh realities of public life. This ideology seemed to elevate women, but it actually imprisoned them. They were worshipped as long as they remained powerless, praised as long as they never challenged male authority. The home became a prison decorated with sentiment. Women were supposed to find fulfillment in domestic duties: cooking, cleaning, sewing, childcare. But these tasks were endless, repetitive, and often mind-numbing. Intelligent women felt their mental faculties atrophying from disuse. They were cut off from politics, business, education, and all the activities that might have given their lives meaning and purpose. Even their clothing was designed to restrict movement and reinforce helplessness. The ideal Victorian woman had an impossibly tiny waist, achieved through tight lacing corsets that compressed the internal organs and made deep breathing difficult. Women regularly fainted from lack of oxygen, which was seen as proof of their delicate femininity rather than evidence of dangerous fashion. The heavy skirts, multiple petticoats, and restrictive undergarments made simple tasks like walking upstairs exhausting. Fashion was another form of control, a way to ensure that women remained physically dependent on men. They couldn't run, couldn't work, couldn't defend themselves. The ideal Victorian woman was literally and figuratively bound. Her movements restricted, her body constrained, her options limited. The double standard was breathtaking in its hypocrisy. While women were expected to remain pure and ignorant, men were encouraged to gain sexual experience before marriage. Prostitution flourished in Victorian cities, providing men with sexual outlets while maintaining the fiction that respectable women were naturally chaste. The same society that condemned women for any hint of impropriety tolerated and even encouraged male promiscuity. Divorce was nearly impossible and socially catastrophic. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 AD allowed divorce in extreme circumstances, but the requirements were dramatically different for men and women. A man could divorce his wife for adultery alone, but a woman had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, or some other offense. The process was expensive, public, and shameful. Even successful divorce left women as social outcasts, cut off from their children and their former lives. Most women who left their husbands simply disappeared into poverty and disgrace. They couldn't reclaim their property, couldn't gain custody of their children, couldn't return to their families without bringing shame on everyone. The threat of social ostracism kept most women trapped in even the most abusive marriages. The case of Caroline Norton illustrates the helplessness of even privileged women. In 1836 AD, Norton left her abusive husband and began a public campaign for legal reform. Her husband responded by claiming custody of their 3 children and refusing to let her see them. He also kept all her earnings from her successful writing career. Norton had no legal recourse. Her husband owned her children, her money, and her work. She spent decades fighting for reform. But the laws didn't change until after her own situation had destroyed her health and happiness. Religion reinforced these patterns of submission and suffering. The church taught that women's subordination was divinely ordained, that Eve's sin had cursed all women to suffer under male authority. Pain in childbirth was God's punishment for female weakness. Domestic violence was a cross to bear, a test of faith, an opportunity for spiritual growth through suffering. The Bible was quoted selectively to support male dominance. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands was repeated endlessly, while passages about mutual love and respect were ignored. Women were taught to find meaning in suffering, to believe that their pain served a higher purpose. This theological framework made resistance seem not just futile, but sinful. The psychological toll was devastating. Women internalized these messages, believing that their suffering was deserved, that their desires were selfish, that their intelligence was unwomanly. They developed what we would now recognize as symptoms of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But Victorian medicine didn't recognize these conditions as legitimate illnesses. Women's emotional distress was dismissed as hysteria, weakness, or moral failing. The famous Victorian nervous disorders were actually normal responses to intolerable situations. Women who couldn't express their frustration, anger, or despair developed physical symptoms instead. They suffered from fainting spells, headaches, paralysis, and mysterious illnesses that baffled doctors. The body rebelled when the mind couldn't. Some women found ways to resist, but the options were limited and dangerous. Writing provided an outlet for a few privileged women, but they often had to publish under male pseudonyms. The Bronte sisters used the names Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. George Eliot was actually Mary Ann Evans. These women had to hide their identities to be taken seriously, and their success was exceptional rather than typical. Other women turned to spiritualism, seances, and religious mysticism, activities that gave them a sense of power and purpose outside the domestic sphere. The spiritualist movement was dominated by women who claimed to communicate with the dead, to receive divine messages, to possess supernatural abilities. These activities were socially acceptable because they were seen as extensions of women's natural spirituality, but they provided a covert form of rebellion. The most desperate women turned to suicide. Though this was rarely recorded honestly, death by drowning, poisoning, or accidental falls were sometimes disguised suicides. Women who chose death over continued suffering. The rates of female suicide in Victorian England were higher than official records suggest, hidden by families ashamed of the stigma. The children of these marriages grew up witnessing systematic oppression, learning that this was normal, that this was how relationships worked. Sons learned to dominate, daughters learned to submit. The cycle perpetuated itself across generations, creating a society where abuse was normalized and resistance was unthinkable. The wealthy had more resources, but not necessarily more freedom. Lady Constance Bulwer-Lytton described her privileged but constrained life in vivid detail. Despite her family's wealth and social position, she had no control over her own decisions, no way to pursue her interests, no escape from the suffocating expectations of her class. She wrote, "I am like a bird in a golden cage, well-fed, well-housed, but still a prisoner." The middle classes aspired to this prison, seeing it as a sign of respectability and success. A woman who didn't have to work was proof of her husband's prosperity. The ideal middle-class wife was ornamental, a status symbol who demonstrated her husband's ability to support a leisured woman. She was educated enough to be interesting, but not so educated as to be threatening. Accomplished enough to be impressive, but not so accomplished as to be competitive. The working classes faced different but equally brutal challenges. Working-class women had to work, but their wages were a fraction of men's wages for the same work. They were doubly burdened, expected to contribute to the family income while also managing all domestic responsibilities. Marriage offered little relief. Working-class wives often worked outside the home while also bearing and raising children, cooking, cleaning, and caring for their husbands. The Industrial Revolution created new forms of exploitation. Women and children worked in factories, mines and mills under dangerous conditions for minimal pay. The textile mills of Manchester, where Margaret Whitmore's husband made his fortune, employed thousands of women and girls who worked 12-hour days in poorly ventilated buildings filled with dangerous machinery. Industrial accidents were common, and workers had no legal protection against employer negligence. The sexual double standard was even more pronounced in working-class communities. A woman's reputation was her only asset, and losing it meant social and economic ruin. But working-class women had less protection from male predation. They worked alongside men, lived in crowded conditions, and had no chaperones to guard their virtue. They were more vulnerable to sexual assault and less likely to receive support if they were victimized. Pregnancy outside marriage was catastrophic for working-class women. They lost their jobs, their homes, and their family's support. Infanticide was tragically common, as desperate women killed their newborns rather than faced destitution. The baby farming scandal of the 1860s AD revealed networks of women who took in unwanted infants for a fee, then deliberately neglected them until they died. These women they were responding to a society that offered no support for unmarried mothers. The legal system reflected and reinforced these inequalities. Women couldn't serve on juries, couldn't practice law, couldn't testify against their husbands in court. Their testimony was considered less reliable than men's, their character more easily questioned. Rape cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute because the victim's sexual history was considered relevant to her credibility. A woman who had any prior sexual experience was assumed to be lying about rape. The medical profession was equally biased. Doctors believed that women's bodies were inherently pathological, that menstruation made them temporarily insane, that their reproductive organs controlled their behavior. The field of gynecology developed through experimentation on enslaved women who were operated on without anesthesia because doctors believed that black women felt less pain than white women. These racist and sexist assumptions influenced medical practice for decades. The development of obstetrics was particularly troubling. Male doctors gradually took over childbirth, displacing female midwives who had centuries of experience. But male doctors had no practical knowledge of pregnancy and childbirth. They had never experienced it themselves and were often forbidden from examining women's bodies directly. They relied on textbooks written by other men, creating a dangerous cycle of ignorance and incompetence. The use of forceps and other instruments increased dramatically under male management, often causing more harm than help. Doctors performed unnecessary surgeries, prescribed dangerous medications, and created complications that midwives had previously avoided. The medicalization of childbirth was presented as progress, but it actually increased maternal mortality rates in many areas. The psychological impact of this systematic oppression was profound and lasting. Women developed what we would now recognize as learned helplessness, the belief that resistance was futile, that their suffering was inevitable, that they had no power to change their circumstances. This psychological conditioning was so effective that many women genuinely believed they were naturally inferior, that their subordination was biologically determined. The few women who did rebel faced severe consequences. Frances Wright, a Scottish reformer who advocated for women's rights in the 1820s AD, was denounced as a dangerous radical and driven from public life. She was called the Great Red Harlot of Infidelity and faced threats of violence for her advocacy. Her experience showed other women the price of resistance. The suffrage movement didn't emerge until the 1860s AD, and even then it faced fierce opposition. The idea that women should have political rights was considered not just wrong, but dangerous, a threat to the natural order of society. Anti-suffrage groups argued that voting would destroy women's femininity, break up families, and lead to social chaos. The opponents of women's suffrage weren't just defending male privilege. They were defending an entire worldview based on female subordination. The marriage market became increasingly calculating as the century progressed. The rise of industrial capitalism created new forms of wealth and social mobility, but also new anxieties about status and respectability. Marriage became a business transaction, with detailed negotiations about dowries, settlements, and inheritance rights. Love was a luxury that few could afford. The season in London epitomized this commodification of marriage. Young women were presented at court, attended balls and parties, and were evaluated by potential suitors and their families. The process was dehumanizing. Women were judged like livestock, their value determined by their appearance, their family connections, and their financial prospects. The social ritual of courtship disguised what was essentially a slave market. The pressure on young women was enormous. They had one chance to make a good marriage, usually in their late teens or early 20s. If they failed to secure a husband during their first few seasons, they were considered damaged goods. The fear of ending up as an old maid drove many women to accept unsuitable matches, prioritizing security over compatibility. The decline of arranged marriages didn't necessarily improve women's situation. The ideology of romantic love created new forms of pressure and disappointment. Women were told they should marry for love, but they were also expected to find that love within the narrow confines of their social class and family expectations. The contradiction was impossible to resolve. The rise of the companionate marriage ideal in the later Victorian period promised greater equality between spouses. But the reality often fell short. Men were still the legal and economic heads of household. Women were still expected to subordinate their interests to their careers, and the fundamental power imbalance remained unchanged. The new ideology simply dressed up old inequalities in more attractive language. The development of psychology as a field reinforced gender stereotypes rather than challenging them. Early psychologists like Gustave Le Bon argued that women's brains were smaller and less developed than men's, that they were naturally suited for domestic life rather than intellectual pursuits. These scientific arguments gave new legitimacy to old prejudices. The education of girls reflected these beliefs. Even wealthy families provided their daughters with only superficial accomplishments: a little French, some drawing, perhaps piano lessons. The goal was to make them attractive to potential husbands, not to develop their intellectual capabilities. Higher education for women was considered dangerous, likely to cause sterility, mental breakdown, or unwomanly behavior. The few women who did receive advanced education faced enormous obstacles. They were excluded from most universities, denied access to professional careers, and subjected to constant scrutiny and criticism. The first women doctors, lawyers, and scientists were treated as curiosities at best. dangerous aberrations at worst. Their success was seen as evidence of their unwomanly nature rather than proof of their capabilities. The Victorian era's emphasis on respectability created new forms of social control. Women's behavior was constantly monitored and judged, not just by men, but by other women who had internalized the same standards. The pressure to maintain appearances was exhausting and expensive. Women spent enormous amounts of time and money on clothing, grooming, and social rituals that served no purpose except to demonstrate their submission to social expectations. The cult of true womanhood created impossible standards that no real woman could meet. The ideal woman was simultaneously innocent and wise, strong and fragile, passionate and pure. She was supposed to be naturally maternal, but also eternally youthful, intellectually stimulating, but not intellectually challenging, morally superior, but politically powerless. These contradictions drove many women to despair as they struggled to embody an impossible ideal. The hypocrisy of Victorian society was particularly evident in its treatment of sexuality. While respectable women were supposed to be pure and ignorant, the society depended on the labor of prostitutes, actresses, and other women who were condemned as fallen. The Madonna whore complex was built into the structure of society, creating a system where some women were worshipped for their purity while others were exploited for their sexuality. The conditions in Victorian workhouses revealed the true attitude toward women who failed to conform to social expectations. Pregnant women, elderly spinsters, and other undesirable women were housed in institutions that were deliberately punitive. The goal was to make the workhouse less attractive than the worst possible marriage, ensuring that women would accept any husband rather than face destitution. The rise of consumer culture in the later Victorian period created new forms of female oppression. Women were targeted as consumers, encouraged to spend money on clothing, household goods, and personal care products. But they were also criticized for their supposed vanity and materialism. The same society that created the demand for feminine consumption condemned women for responding to that demand. The development of department stores and fashion magazines created new pressures for women to conform to changing standards of beauty and respectability. The ideal woman was constantly evolving, forcing women to spend enormous amounts of time and money trying to keep up with fashion. The beauty industry emerged as a powerful force, creating insecurities that it then promised to solve. The Victorian period saw the creation of the modern wedding industry, with its emphasis on white dresses, elaborate ceremonies, and romantic ideals. But these rituals disguised the fundamental reality of marriage as a legal and economic transaction. The white wedding dress symbolized the bride's purity and innocence, but it also represented her transformation from person to property. The honeymoon tradition developed as a to ease the transition from courtship to marriage, giving couples privacy to consummate their relationship away from family scrutiny. But for many women, the honeymoon was a traumatic experience, as they encountered the reality of sexual obligation for the first time. The romantic language surrounding marriage couldn't disguise the fact that many women were effectively sold into sexual slavery. The development of life insurance reflected the economic reality of women's dependence. Husbands could take out policies on their wives' lives, creating a financial incentive for women to die young. The insurance industry calculated women's value based on their reproductive capacity and domestic labor, treating them as economic assets rather than human beings. The rise of photography documented Victorian women's lives in unprecedented detail, but it also revealed the extent of their constraints. Family portraits show women in rigid poses, their expressions carefully composed, their clothing elaborately restrictive. The photographs that survive show us women who were literally and figuratively bound by the expectations of their era. The development of the novel as a literary form gave women new ways to explore their experiences and express their frustrations. Writers like Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, and George Eliot created female characters who struggled against social constraints, who demanded more from life than marriage and motherhood. But these fictional heroines were often punished for their rebellion, dying young or learning to accept their limitations. The sensation novels of the 1860s AD revealed the dark underbelly of Victorian marriage, featuring bigamy, adultery, and domestic violence. These stories were dismissed as sensationalist trash, but they reflected real anxieties about women's powerlessness and vulnerability. The popularity of these novels suggested that readers were hungry for stories that acknowledged the reality of women's lives. The development of the telegraph and postal system created new possibilities for women's communication and organization. Women could correspond with each other across distances, sharing experiences and providing mutual support. The letter-writing networks that developed among Victorian women were crucial to the eventual emergence of feminist consciousness. The rise of philanthropy gave some women a socially acceptable way to leave their homes and engage with public issues. Charitable work was seen as an extension of women's natural nurturing instincts, but it also provided opportunities for leadership and social engagement. The women's temperance movement in particular gave women a platform to critique male behavior and advocate for social reform. The development of birth control methods, though primitive and often dangerous, gave some women a degree of control over their reproductive lives. The knowledge was passed down through informal networks of women, shared in whispered conversations and coded letters. The medical establishment opposed contraception, but women continued to seek ways to limit their families and preserve their health. The Civil War in America and the Crimean War in Europe created new opportunities for women to work as nurses, teachers, and organizers. These experiences gave women confidence and skills that they would later use in the fight for political rights. The wartime emergency made it acceptable for women to take on roles that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The development of the department store as a social institution created new spaces where women could move freely and interact with each other. Shopping became a form of social activity, giving women a reason to leave their homes and engage with the broader world. The tea rooms and rest areas in department stores became informal meeting places, where women could discuss their lives and share their concerns. The rise of the new woman in the 1880s AD represented a direct challenge to Victorian ideals of femininity. These women pursued higher education, professional careers, and political activism. They rejected the cult of domesticity and demanded equality with men. But they also faced enormous backlash as societies struggled to accommodate women who refused to accept their traditional roles. The medical profession's response to the new woman revealed the extent of Victorian anxieties about changing gender roles. Doctors warned that education and career ambitions would damage women's reproductive health, that intellectual activity would cause their wombs to atrophy, that women who pursued careers would become sterile and masculine. These medical warnings were presented as scientific fact, but they were actually expressions of cultural anxiety about women's changing roles. The bicycle craze of the 1890s AD gave women unprecedented physical freedom and mobility. For the first time, women could travel independently, covering distances that would have been impossible on foot. The bicycle became a symbol of women's liberation, and it was fiercely opposed by conservatives who saw it as a threat to feminine propriety. The The debate over women's cycling revealed the extent to which women's movements had been restricted and controlled. The development of the typewriter and other office technologies created new employment opportunities for women. But these jobs were carefully segregated and paid less than men's work. The office became a new site of gender inequality, as women were hired as subordinates and denied opportunities for advancement. The image of the female secretary reinforced stereotypes about women's natural role as helpers and supporters rather than leaders. The rise of the fashion industry created new forms of female employment, but also new forms of exploitation. Women worked in garment factories under dangerous conditions for minimal pay, creating the elaborate clothing that wealthy women wore. The fashion industry depended on the labor of working-class women, who could never afford the products they made. The development of mass media created new ways to spread both feminist ideas and anti-feminist propaganda. Women's magazines reinforced traditional gender roles, while also providing information about household management, childcare, and fashion. The tension between these messages reflected the broader cultural confusion about women's proper role in society. The legal reforms of the late Victorian period began to address some of the most egregious inequalities, but progress was slow and limited. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 gave women some control over their own earnings and property, but they still faced significant legal disabilities. The reforms were often undermined by conservative judges and social pressure. The emergence of the women's suffrage movement represented the culmination of decades of frustration and organizing. The demand for political rights was both radical and logical. If women were responsible for their own behavior, they should have a voice in making the laws that governed them. But the opposition to women's suffrage was fierce and sometimes violent, revealing the extent to which political power was seen as exclusively male. The anti-suffrage movement was led largely by women who had internalized the ideology of separate spheres and feared that political rights would destroy women's special role in society. These women argued that voting would corrupt women's natural purity and drag them down to the level of men. The debate over women's suffrage became a debate about the nature of womanhood itself. The tactics of the suffrage movement evolved from polite petitioning to militant action as women became frustrated with the slow pace of reform. The suffragettes' use of violence and civil disobedience shocked Victorian society, which had never seen women behave in such unfeminine ways. The government's violent response to the suffragettes revealed the extent to which the state was willing to use force to maintain male dominance. The force-feeding of suffragette prisoners was a particularly brutal example of state violence against women. The government treated women's political activism as a form of mental illness, using medical procedures as punishment. The force-feeding was both physically dangerous and psychologically traumatic, designed to break women's will and discourage others from joining the movement. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 AD transformed the debate over women's rights and roles. The war created new opportunities for women to work in factories, offices, and hospitals, demonstrating their capabilities and challenging traditional gender roles. The war also revealed the contradictions in a society that claimed to value women's domestic role, while depending on their economic and social contributions. The war's end brought a partial victory for women's suffrage, but it also brought new challenges. The return of male soldiers created pressure for women to give up their wartime jobs and return to domestic life. The ideology of separate spheres was reasserted, though it could never fully contain women's expanded aspirations and capabilities. As the sun set on the Victorian era, the world Margaret Whitmore had known was beginning to crumble. The rigid certainties about women's nature and role were being challenged by new ideas, new technologies, and new social movements. But the legacy of Victorian marriage would persist for decades, shaping gender relations well into the 20th century. The women who had suffered in silence during the Victorian era had laid the groundwork for future generations of activists and reformers. Their experiences of oppression and resistance created the foundation for the women's rights movement that would eventually transform society. The price of progress was measured in decades of women's pain, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The Victorian era's treatment of women in marriage was not an aberration, nor a historical curiosity. It was the logical result of a society that valued women's subordination more than their humanity. The legal, the economic, and social structures that trapped women in abusive marriages were carefully constructed and deliberately maintained. They served the interests of a patriarchal society that depended on women's unpaid labor and sexual availability. The romantic myths about Victorian marriage that persist in popular culture serve to obscure this history of oppression and resistance. The image of the devoted wife and loving husband masks the reality of systematic abuse, legal inequality, and psychological trauma that defined most Victorian marriages. The transformation of marriage from a romantic ideal to a legal contract of ownership didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of legal precedent, religious doctrine, and social conditioning that gradually stripped women of their rights and dignity. The Victorian era represented the culmination of this process, the moment when women's subordination was most complete and most carefully rationalized. The Industrial Revolution had created new wealth and new social anxieties, but it had also created new forms of exploitation. The same economic forces that built the great Victorian fortunes also created the conditions that made women's oppression both necessary and profitable. The domestic sphere became a site of unpaid labor that subsidized the industrial economy, while the ideology of separate spheres disguised this exploitation as natural and beneficial. The medical establishment's role in maintaining women's subordination cannot be overstated. By pathologizing women's bodies and minds, doctors created scientific justifications for legal and social inequalities. The treatment of women as inherently diseased and unstable provided a rationale for their exclusion from public life and their confinement to domestic roles. The religious institutions that blessed Victorian marriages also sanctified women's suffering. The Church taught that pain was redemptive, that submission was virtuous, that resistance was sinful. These theological frameworks gave divine sanction to human cruelty, making it easier for both perpetrators and victims to accept the unacceptable. The educational system reinforced these patterns by denying women access to knowledge and skills that might have given them independence. The deliberate cultivation of female ignorance was not an accident, but a strategy, a way to ensure that women would remain dependent on men for information, resources, and decision-making. The legal system completed the circle of oppression by denying women any recourse against abuse, any right to their own property, any voice in their own governance. The law treated women as perpetual minors, incapable of managing their own affairs, unworthy of protection, and undeserving of justice. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of Victorian marriage was the way it turned women against each other. The ideology of respectability created hierarchies among women, dividing them into categories of worthy and unworthy, pure and fallen, successful and failed. Women policed each other's behavior, enforcing the very standards that oppressed them all. The competition for husbands created artificial scarcity and desperate competition. Women were taught to see each other as rivals rather than allies, to guard their secrets rather than share their experiences, to suffer alone rather than organize collectively. This isolation was carefully maintained because solidarity would have been dangerous to the existing order. The cost of this system was enormous, not just for women but for society as a whole. The waste of human potential was staggering. Brilliant minds trapped in domestic drudgery, creative talents stifled by social expectations, leadership abilities suppressed by legal constraints. The Victorian era could have been a time of unprecedented human flourishing, but instead, it became a monument to systematic oppression. The women who lived through this era developed remarkable strategies for survival and resistance. They created underground networks of support, shared information through coded conversations, and found ways to express their frustrations through acceptable channels. The strength and resilience they displayed in the face of overwhelming oppression is a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be completely broken. The suffrage movement that emerged from this era was not just about voting rights. It was about human dignity, about the right to exist as a full person rather than as someone's property. The women who chained themselves to railings, who endured force-feeding, who faced imprisonment and social ostracism, were fighting for something much larger than political representation. They were fighting for the right to be human. The legacy of Victorian marriage persisted long after the era ended. The legal doctrines, social attitudes, and cultural assumptions that defined women's roles in the 19th century continued to shape gender relations throughout the 20th century and beyond. The fight for equality that began in the Victorian era continues today, in different forms, but with the same fundamental goal: the recognition of women's full humanity. The economic arguments for women's subordination have evolved but not disappeared. The same logic that justified women's exclusion from property ownership now justifies wage gaps and occupational segregation. The same assumptions about women's natural roles that trapped Victorian wives in servitude now create pressure for modern women to choose between career and family. The medical establishment's treatment of women has improved dramatically, but the tendency to pathologize female experience persists. The hysteria diagnosis has been replaced by other labels, but the underlying assumption that women's complaints are often psychological rather than physical continues to influence medical practice. The religious justifications for women's subordination have been challenged and largely abandoned in mainstream denominations, but they persist in conservative religious communities. The same biblical passages that were used to justify Victorian women's suffering are still quoted to support traditional gender roles and male authority. The educational barriers that limited Victorian women's opportunities have been largely dismantled, but subtle forms of discouragement and discrimination continue to shape women's choices and limit their achievements. The belief that women are naturally suited for some fields, but not others, continues to influence everything from college admissions to career advancement. The legal framework that made Victorian women the property of their husbands has been reformed. But the underlying power dynamics that made those laws possible have not been completely transformed. The same attitudes that made marital rape legally impossible continue to influence how sexual assault cases are handled by police, prosecutors, and judges. The most persistent legacy of Victorian marriage may be the way it normalized violence against women and created a culture of silence around abuse. The idea that what happens between a husband and wife is private, that domestic violence is a family matter rather than a crime, that women who stay in abusive relationships are somehow complicit in their own victimization. These attitudes have deep roots in Victorian ideology. The romantic mythology that surrounds Victorian marriage serves a contemporary political purpose, providing a nostalgic vision of traditional gender roles that never actually existed. The image of the happy Victorian family, with its devoted wife and protective husband, is used to argue for a return to values that were actually systems of oppression. The women who suffered in Victorian marriages were not passive victims, but active agents who found ways to resist, survive, and sometimes thrive despite overwhelming constraints. Their stories remind us that human dignity cannot be completely destroyed, that the desire for freedom and equality is stronger than the systems designed to suppress it. The medical records, legal documents, and personal letters that survive from the Victorian era provide a counter-narrative to the official story of happy domesticity. They reveal the daily reality of women's lives, the small acts of rebellion and resistance that kept hope alive, the networks of support that sustained women through their darkest moments. The transformation of marriage from an institution of oppression to one of partnership was not inevitable. It was the result of decades of struggle by women who refused to accept their subordination as natural or necessary. The legal reforms, social changes, and cultural shifts that improved women's status were achieved through the courage and persistence of women who faced enormous personal costs for their activism. The price of progress was measured in individual lives destroyed, in potential unfulfilled, in dreams deferred across generations. The women who died in childbirth, who suffered in silence, who never had the chance to develop their talents or pursue their interests. They were the casualties of a system that valued social stability over human dignity. But their sacrifice was not meaningless. Each woman who resisted, each woman who spoke out, each woman who refused to accept her subordination as natural, contributed to the slow transformation of consciousness that eventually made change possible. The suffrage movement, the legal reforms, the social changes that followed were built on the foundation of countless individual acts of resistance. The Victorian era's treatment of women in marriage was not unique in human history, but it was uniquely well documented and rationalized. The same patterns of oppression that characterized Victorian marriage can be found in other times and places, adapted to different cultural contexts, but following the same basic logic of male dominance and female subordination. The study of Victorian marriage reveals the mechanisms by which oppression is maintained and justified. It shows how legal, economic, religious, and social institutions can work together to create and maintain systems of inequality. It demonstrates the importance of ideology in making oppression seem natural and inevitable. But it also shows the power of human resistance, the way that even the most complete systems of oppression generate their own opposition. The women who lived through the Victorian era created the intellectual and organized national foundations for the movements that would eventually transform society. Their experiences of oppression became the source of their strength and their determination to create a better world. The Victorian era ended, but its lessons remain relevant. The same forces that created and maintained women's oppression in the 19th century continue to operate in different forms today. The same strategies that were used to justify women's subordination are still employed to defend other forms of inequality and injustice. The women who fought against Victorian marriage were not just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for future generations, for the principle that all human beings deserve dignity and equality. Their victory was incomplete, but it was real. The world they created was not perfect, but it was better than the one they inherited. Tonight, as we close this examination of Victorian marriage, We return to that townhouse in Manchester, 1847 AD. Margaret Whitmore's tears have dried, but the silence that follows is not peace. It is the quiet of a woman gathering her strength for another day, another act of small resistance, another moment of survival in a world designed to destroy her spirit. The wallpaper in her bedroom is faded, the pattern worn thin by years of desperate staring during sleepless nights. But in the morning light filtering through the heavy curtains, she will rise again, dress carefully to hide the bruises, and face the day with the same courage that countless women before and after her have summoned in the face of impossible odds. Her story is not unique, but it is not forgotten. In every woman who refuses to accept less than she deserves, in every law that protects rather than oppresses, in every marriage based on equality rather than ownership. Margaret's resistance lives on. The Victorian era may be over, but the struggle for human dignity continues. And the women who suffered in silence behind those lace curtains have not suffered in vain.